Hi guys, welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be playing in makeup and talking to you about Typhoid Mary, who was the first asymptomatic carrier of typhoid in America that's been identified. The end. Just kidding. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put on my foundation because I've tried filming this several times. I cannot seem to foundation and talk at the same time, so I'm going to do that and do a voiceover of what typhoid is. Hope you enjoy. Hello. I apologize that she did not introduce herself, but you are watching Kiki Cleaverhausen, an unlicensed historian. But I'm from HR, and I'll be popping in from time to time anytime Kiki says something that is perhaps sensationalized or just isn't true. I'm sure we will be seeing a lot of each other in the future.
So before I actually explain to you what typhoid fever is, I just want to put out this disclaimer for any of my hypochondriacs watching. The likelihood of you catching or having typhoid fever would be highly unlikely, especially if you live in the US or any other developed nation in the world. This is something that is extremely rare. It's usually looked at as an old-timey disease. Okay? I digress. Typhoid fever is caused by the bacteria Salmonella typhi, which is the same family that causes salmonella poisoning. However, these are two different illnesses in different branches. Salmonella poisoning is usually associated with, say, undercooked chicken. Typhoid fever, though also stems from contaminated food or water, they're two different illnesses. If you do so happen or you suspect that you have typhoid fever, you're most likely going to have the following symptoms: fever, headache, body aches. You're going to have a stomach pain, diarrhea, or possibly even constipation. You're also going, or you could develop a rash on your body. And you also will feel a bit of malaise. Now, I know we all know what malaise is because I certainly did before I looked it up, which is just that you feel restless and despondent. But just know, if you do think that you have typhoid fever, there is a cure. So, again, this is more of an old-timey disease for us here. Hope you enjoy watching me play in my makeup. Now back to Mary.
Mary Mallon was born in Ireland in 1868, and then in the 1880s, she immigrated to the US. Now, our story does not begin to take place, or it's just an average person just trying to keep a roof over her head. She's, working in this domestic service industry, specifically as a cook for these wealthy families. So wasn't anything overly special before, or that we knew of before 1907. Now, this is what had happened. Okay, so, and then we're gonna go back 1 year, because in 1906, this wealthy family of New York, the Warrens, the patriarch of the family, his name was Henry Warren. He worked as a banker, and him and his family would be summering, as one does when you have that type of money, in Oyster Bay, New York. And they were going to be staying at this house, and they needed a cook, and their cook had kind of actually just left them in a little bit of a pinch, and there was going to be about 11 people there, so they needed a cook ASAP. Mary was recommended to them, and they hit up Mary. They're like, hey, we need a cook. Are you able to help us out, and can you come today? And she's like, absolutely, I can come do that. So Mary starts working for the family for that summer, and everything's going, normal, nothing crazy, except at the end of August, beginning of September, everyone in the family gets typhoid. Okay? Now, typhoid wasn't really the disease that hit the upper class like that. They're like, we're rich, we don't get that disease. That was not a direct quote. So, Mr. Warren hires this gentleman by the name of George Soper to come and figure out how in the world him and his family caught typhoid. Okay? Again, this wasn't a disease for the upper class. And I'll explain why. So, you can get typhoid from contaminated food or a contaminated water source. This is from poor hygiene, and typically it's from like fecal to oral transmission. Hello? And a lot of this, most of the outbreaks wind up happening in the poorer parts of New York, or, just reality, or really all over, just the poorer parts, the lower class citizens. Usually this, happened at because they didn't have access to clean water or, uncontaminated water source. And again, it also has to do with hygiene. So if you don't have a good water source, you're not washing your hands, which during this time wasn't a thing anyway, but you know what I'm saying. So anyway, with them mostly experiencing Scrooge McDuck syndrome during this time frame, which still to this day, Scrooge McDuck syndrome affects 1% of the population of America, and it typically just affects your arms, in which you can't carry, your arms hurt because you're carrying your money around and it's just really heavy. So it really kind of hurts your muscles. But 99% of Americans, this does not affect because we do not meet the minimum wealth requirements for that to happen to us. That's not a real disease. Anyway, I digress. So, he hires George Soper, and George was trained as a civil engineer, but he was really good, honestly, at finding where the spread starts, okay? So, finding these super spreaders of disease, finding the cause of the outbreak, who was patient 0. And this was just really a passion of his, actually. So he was really good at it. Honestly, today we would just call him a contact tracer. So that's pretty much what he did. So he did that, and he starts talking to the family, and he's like, hey, what did you guys eat? And they're like, okay, well, we had some clams and some delicious delicious peach ice cream. Oh, because, real quick, I'm sure you're like, why couldn't it have been the water? Well, because this was only affecting one family on Oyster Bay, it was a very small contaminated outbreak, and because you didn't have a lot of families affected, it's pretty easy to knock out the water source. It's like, okay, clearly that's not the cause of this. George was like, okay, well, it's probably your clams, because I've never had this happen, but I'm sure we've all have heard of people who, they get a hold of bad clams and, shellfish goes bad. So it's just a thing that kind of happens. And the family is like, well, here's the problem with your little theory, Mr. Soper. We didn't all have clams. So how could 11 of us get typhoid if we didn't all have clams? He's like, oh, touche, mon frere. So he's like, okay, well, tell me more about this peach ice cream. And they're like, my stomach is so upset from having typhoid, but I could eat it again. And it was just this delicious peach ice cream, and our cook Mary put fresh peaches on top, just a little something extra, just made it even better. And he's like, and did your cook, did she get sick with typhoid? No, Mary was perfectly fine. I'm thinking it came from the peaches. I'm gonna need to talk to Mary. Well, Mary had left her employment at this time. Don't know why. It doesn't really matter. So he goes to hunt down Mary. And he goes to Mary and he's like, hey, I think that you have typhoid. And she's like, how dare you? How dare you, sir? And here's the deal. Fair. Because in reality, if she had typhoid, she would immediately be fired from her position. Her reputation as a cook would be gone. And remember, she's a good cook. People loved her. Or loved her cooking, I should say. We're going to get to her attitude a little bit differently. So, and she was like, also, here's the deal. I'm perfectly fine. I'm healthy. Never even had typhoid in my life. What are you even coming up here saying this? And he then was like, here's the deal though. I think that you may be an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid. And she's like, that's not a thing. During this time, they didn't know that you could be healthy and have and transmit typhoid, you know, because typhoid wasn't a disease that, or illness that you could just fake, like force your way to work through. That wasn't a thing. Like, you're gonna be down for the count if it didn't kill you, which, by the way, the fatality rate at this time was about 10%. So again, even if you survive it, you're still gonna be down for the count for a minute. Your body's gotta work through it. So, and he was like, here's the deal though. And he's like, I'm pretty sure that you're an asymptomatic carrier. Well, she goes at him with a carving knife. I apologize. Carving fork, okay? Because he asked her for stool samples, which, keep in mind, again, George's not a doctor, not even an actual scientist. Not that it matters. He's a stranger. And he's this rando person asking Mary for her stool and urine. Yeah, you got a right to be like, no, get out of my house. How dare you? That's gross. But I will say this. Over the line, honey. Over the line, coming at him with the carving fork. Too much. No. Good kick out on the street. Not right to go at him with the, you know, a kitchen utensil that you, honestly, let's be honest, you could have killed him with it. And I know you know that. Over the line. Anyway. That was Mary's famous temper though. She was also known for being very short-fused and just, yeah, she was not gonna take it from anybody. During this time though, he's like, okay, this isn't good. He goes to the Board of Health, the New York Board of Health, and he tells them his theory. And they're like, okay, well, here's the deal. What other proof do you have that she's like a healthy carrier? Healthy, right? Again, I didn't know this. Healthy carrier of typhoid. Well, what he had done was he had actually put together a 5-year employment history on Mary. And between 1900 and 1906, she had worked for 8 different families. Out of 8 of those families, 7 of them had a typhoid outbreak while Mary was in their employment. Okay, what a coinky-dink. So, he tells us to the Board of Health, the New York Board of Health, and they're like, yeah, we're gonna need you to bring Mary in. And he's like, already tried that. She's not really willing to come with me. So they're like, okay, you're probably just not talking to her appropriately because, I don't know, maybe you're just not. We all know those people who you talk to, they just can't talk to people. You know, it's like, you just should not be on public or talking. You actually should probably go to like some sort of like finishing school for how to talk to people. And like, maybe you just can't talk to people, you know, it's fine. So they wind up enlisting the help of Dr. Josephine Baker. I would like to stop and appreciate her being a doctor in 1907. Yeah, you go girl. That's impressive. That wasn't a thing. That also wasn't a thing back then. Okay. Her breaking boundaries. Anyway, back to the story. So they enlist her help and they're like, you know, hey, maybe lady to lady, you can talk to her and she, you know, will come to you and provide us samples. She was like, yeah, obviously I'll totally help out. But I feel like because of her past behavior, it might be best to kind of bring the police with me. We're like, okay. So They bring the police. Josephine goes to talk to her. And Mary then winds up running away, escaping. Basically kind of reacting the same way minus the carving fork. She's just like, I'm not coming with you guys. You're crazy. Well, this wild goose chase finally ends after about 5 hours. They wind up taking her, oh, by the way, on the way to the Riverside Hospital in North Brother Island, or on North Brother Island, Dr. Baker is having to sit on top of her. Mary was quite feisty. They get her to North Brother Island, Riverside Hospital on North Brother Island, and they take samples from her. And guess what? I know we're all gonna be shocked here. Yep, she tested positive for typhoid. And they're like, what in the world is this? Okay, that's just crazy. That's not a thing, but it apparently is a thing. So we're like, okay, now you're gonna have to live here because you are a public health hazard. Yeah, you're gonna have to stay here. And she did. She stayed on the island. She was confined to a cottage on the island, and she was there for about 3 years. Now, they did offer to release her in exchange for her gallbladder at one point during this 3 years, and she refused. Now, I'm sure thinking about it in modern times, it's like, oh, someone has forcibly quarantined me. I don't know when I'm going to get out, if ever. You just want to take my gallbladder and then you'll release me. We would actually consider it. Okay, like really consider it. Mary said no. And I don't blame her. Because during this time, that within itself could have been a death sentence. It wasn't, even though it's a fairly simple surgery itself was still very dangerous because then more people wind up dying from infection after your surgery than the actual problem that caused you to get the surgery. I was unable to verify what she just said, but I will say this. Surgeries during those times did have a bit of a higher fatality rate than they did today. So, yeah, no, it's definitely completely reasonable of her to be like, you're not taking my gallbladder. No. Fair enough, Mary, fair enough. Now, the public had also become aware of the situation with Mary. And all these newspapers started picking up the story, which is where we get Typhoid Mary from. That's who gave it to her, newspaper people. So they pick up the story, and honestly, they just weren't kind to her they just weren't very nice. They were just really rude stories. She had like a child's nursery rhyme about her, which anytime you have a child's nursery rhyme about you, not gonna end well, right? Not a good thing. The nursery rhyme, just for those who are curious, is like, Mary, Mary, what do you carry? So, yeah. But the public was actually on her side, and they're like, this is BS. She's being forcibly quarantined. She didn't know she was a carrier. You didn't even know it was a carrier, talking to the, to the Board of Health. They're like, you didn't even know that was a thing. No one knew that was a thing. And now it is a thing. So how do we deal with this thing? But you don't deal with it by forcibly quarantining her. That's un-American almost. What is it? I'll get into it in a second. She winds up hiring a lawyer, which rumor has it, in case you're like, how could she afford a lawyer? Rumor has it that one of the newspaper tycoons at the time, possibly William Randolph Hearst, this is all hearsay, paid for her attorney. And that probably just came in exchange from some sort of exclusive rights or something. They get their way in the deal, and she gets a lawyer. This is better than a gallbladder, I can tell you that. So she winds up getting an attorney, and he takes it all the way to the Supreme Court. And it's like, my client hasn't had their due process. This is BS. Love, the usual line of defense for this. And the Supreme Court was like, yeah, no, don't care. she can live on the island. She is a health hazard. We're keeping her there. But luckily for Mary, again, like I said, she had the public on her side on this. There was a new director at the New York Board of Health, and he agreed to release Mary under the condition that she would sign an affidavit no longer working as a cook. Like, she could not work as a cook in the future, okay? Because see, what was happening was anytime she baked her dishes, right? So the typhoid was on her hands, basically. That's how it was spreading through the food. And anytime she baked the dishes, it reaches a certain temperature, it kills the typhoid, so the family was fine. But whenever she would serve the fresh fruits, because she's using her bare hands and serving the fresh fruits, that's when the typhoid would spread on those because they weren't cooked. She's like, yeah, I will sign your affidavit. I promise that I will not work as a cook ever again. Okay. Yeah. See where this is going. I see you out there. You know. Anyway, so she finally gets released. Keep in mind, she was locked up from 1907 to 1910, so she gets released in around 1910, and she signed that agreement. And she does try to stick to it for a bit. She gets a job as a laundress for a while, which is okay work, but it doesn't pay like being a cook does. Being a cook was one of the higher paid jobs when you worked for these families. So she changes her name and she starts cooking again, okay? Now, as I'm sure y'all know, yeah, there were outbreaks. Everywhere she went, there was an outbreak, and she would just magically disappear. The Board of Health, they're on it, and they're like, I just have a sneaky suspicion that this is Mary, right? We just think this is Mary Mallon. This has Mary Mallon written all over it, okay? We can't find her because she keeps leaving and changing her name. So they spend the next 5 years trying to hunt her down. Now, what winds up getting her caught is in 1915. This is me being like, why Mary? Why would you do this? But in 1915, she starts working for this women's hospital in New Jersey, okay? So again, she starts working as a cook. And there is an outbreak that affects 25 people, and 2 of them die. And again, they're just like, this has Mary written all over it, okay? And it's like, of course, and with it being a hospital, not only is she serving more people, but you're also you're in a hospital. You're already dealing with people who have lower immune system for whatever reason. Of course, they're going to be way more susceptible to typhoid, but again, who wasn't susceptible to typhoid? Okay, and they finally catch her, and she's like, I still don't believe you. I'm perfectly fine. I don't have typhoid. There's no real, that's not a thing for me to be a carrier of it. And they're like, it is a thing. Get in the car. Just kidding. They probably didn't put her in a car because this was in 1814. The car had just been around. I don't think they were using it. Whatever. She gets sent back to North Brother Island, Riverside Hospital, where she literally spends the rest of her life there. So Mary spends the rest of her life there, and she dies in 1938 of pneumonia. But 6 years prior to the pneumonia, she actually ends up, she had a stroke and she was left paralyzed and unable to walk the last 6 years of her life. Now, here's where it gets really sad. So, it is actually known that no one ever actually sat down and talked to Mary about what was going on with her. No one ever explained it to her. They just constantly took samples. And though in later parts of her life, she was able, during the second quarantine / imprisonment, she was able to work in the help with the labs, washing bottles, like just doing some stuff on the within the hospital. I mean, that's pretty lonely. It's very sad existence. And unfortunately, with her second quarantine, she lost her previous public fans, because they're like, we helped you, we got you out, but you didn't listen. But again, no one ever talked to her about it. And we don't know if she was ever treated for typhoid. You see, a vaccine for typhoid came out in 1911, which was 1 year after she was released from her first quarantine. And by the time she died, over 400 people in New York alone had been identified as asymptomatic carriers of typhoid. Some of those who wound up spreading it further and honestly harming more people, but none of them suffered the same fate as Mary. None of them. Not a single one. There is no, oh, did you also hear about Typhoid Antonio, or, Typhoid Thomas, or, Typhoid Angela. There's none of that, right? We don't hear about any of those stories either. But on that same side, she also didn't listen, right? Dr. Baker did wind up writing that one of Mary's tragic and most fatal flaws was that she never believed them from the beginning. And granted, they wouldn't explain it to her, and that's within itself wrong. She clearly didn't listen, because by the time she got called the second time, she had spread typhoid to at least 55 people. Some accounts even go up to 122. And of those, 5 of them died. Yeah, not great. But again, here's the deal. She wasn't nefarious about this. She wasn't intentionally killing people. She just really did not understand what it was. But on that same token, she wouldn't really listen to anyone. I mean, seriously, she had to be sat on to be brought into a lab the first time. But I get her personality, or her natural reaction was a bit much for a lot of people, but doesn't give you the right to just not communicate with them. Yeah, it's going to be annoying, and you're going to need backup when dealing with Mary, but doesn't mean that you don't do that. But yeah, so that is what happened to Mary, to Typhoid Mary. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more, and I'll be talking about some more historical stories in the future.